I thought it was just another familiar gathering, the kind where nothing ever changes. But one quiet conversation at a crowded party shifted how I saw myself, my marriage, and the people around me. Stay with me, because what happened surprised me more than anyone. Before I begin, I'd love to know where you're watching from. What city are you in right now? And if stories like this speak to you, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and like the video. It truly helps us continue sharing meaningful stories like this one. Now, let me tell you what happened. The party was already loud when I stepped into the living room, the familiar hum of voices layered over old music playing too softly to compete. We'd hosted gatherings like this for years, my husband and I, same faces, same jokes, same folding chairs pulled too close together. I was somewhere between 40 and 60 then, at that age where you start to notice time not as a straight line, but as a collection of moments you either paid attention to or let slip by. I remember smoothing my blouse, more out of habit than concern, and scanning the room. My husband was near the kitchen, laughing with two of his longtime friends. They'd known each other since before I came into the picture, back when hair was darker and plans felt endless. I felt content watching him, but also oddly invisible, like a familiar piece of furniture everyone appreciates without really seeing. That's when I noticed him. My husband's friend, not the loud one or the storyteller, but the quieter presence who always seemed to listen more than he spoke. He stood near the bookshelf, holding a drink he barely touched, observing the room with the same careful attention I felt inside myself. Our eyes met briefly. He nodded politely, the way you do when you've shared a table 100 times but never a real conversation. I expected that to be the end of it. Instead, a few minutes later, as the noise swelled and shifted, he found himself beside me. "Busy night," he said, his voice calm, steady. "It is," I replied, surprised by how relieved I felt to be talking to someone who wasn't trying to be entertaining. Feels like every year sounds louder than the last. He smiled at that, not wide, just enough to show he understood. Or maybe we're just listening differently now. That simple comment landed deeper than I expected. We'd moved a little away from the crowd, not to isolate ourselves, but to hear each other without shouting. The lamp in the corner cast a warm glow, and for the first time that evening, I felt grounded. We talked about ordinary things at first. Work, how quickly the seasons seemed to pass, how strange it felt to watch our children grow into adults with opinions of their own. There was no agenda in his words, no sense of crossing a line. Just presence, just attention. What surprised me most was how he asked questions and then waited for the answers. Not the polite pauses people give while planning their next sentence, but real listening. When I spoke, he looked at me, not past me or around me. I felt heard in a way I hadn't realized I'd been missing. At one point, laughter erupted from the kitchen, and I glanced over instinctively. My husband caught my eye and smiled, secure, comfortable. There was no secrecy in where I stood or who I was talking to. That mattered to me more than I could explain. "You seem thoughtful tonight," my husband's friend said gently. "I think I am," I admitted. Sometimes you don't realize how much you're carrying until someone asks how you're doing and actually means it. He nodded slowly. "I get that. Life piles up quietly." The words stayed with me. Life piles up quietly. I felt a shift inside, not dramatic, not dangerous, but real. A reminder that I was still a person with thoughts worth sharing, not just a role I played at gatherings like this. As the party continued around us, I became aware of the room in sharper detail. The clink of glasses, the creak of the floorboards, the smell of food lingering in the air. Everything felt more vivid, as if that simple conversation had turned up the brightness on the evening. Eventually, someone called his name, and he excused himself without hesitation. "I'm glad we talked," he said sincerely. "So am I replied. He walked away, blending back into the familiar crowd, and I stood there for a moment longer, reflecting. Nothing improper had happened. No lines crossed. Yet something meaningful had begun to stir. A sense of personal discovery. A quiet acknowledgement that connection, even brief and unexpected, could remind you of who you are. That night, as I watched the party unfold, I realized that sometimes the most surprising moments aren't loud or dramatic. Sometimes they arrive in a calm voice, a shared understanding, and a conversation you didn't know you needed. The days after the party lingered with me in a quiet way. Nothing had changed on the surface. Dishes still needed washing, errands still filled the afternoons, and my husband still greeted me each morning with the same easy familiarity. Yet somewhere beneath all that, a small awareness had been stirred, like a window cracked open just enough to let fresh air in. I didn't speak about that conversation to anyone, not because it felt secret, but because it felt personal. It belonged to me. I found myself replaying certain moments while folding laundry or waiting at traffic lights. The way he listened. The way he didn't rush to fill the silence. It reminded me of parts of myself I hadn't checked in on for a long time. About a week later, my husband mentioned that we'd been invited to a casual get-together at another friend's place. "Nothing big," he said, glancing up from his phone. "Just a few people." I felt a small pause inside me. I knew he would be there. My husband's friend. I nodded, keeping my tone even. "Sounds nice." The evening arrived cooler than expected, the kind of night where the air carries the promise of autumn, even if summer hasn't quite let go. The house we visited was familiar, filled with warm lighting and well-worn furniture. As people arrived, coats were draped over chairs, conversations overlapped, and the usual comfort of routine settled in. I spotted him across the room again, this time talking with someone near the window. He looked relaxed, his posture open, the same quiet energy I remembered. Our eyes met briefly, and this time there was recognition, a shared understanding that we'd already crossed that invisible line from strangers to something more aware. Later, as my husband became absorbed in a discussion about home repairs, I found myself near the back porch, looking out into the dimly lit yard. The sounds of conversation softened behind me. "Funny how stepping outside changes the noise," he said, appearing beside me without startling me. "It does," I replied. "It's like the world gives you a moment to breathe." We stood there, not too close, not distant either. The porch light cast long shadows, and the night air felt grounding. Our conversation resumed easily, as if it had only been paused, not ended. He asked me about things I enjoyed, not just what filled my time, but what genuinely interested me. When I spoke about old hobbies, books I loved, moments when I felt most myself, he listened with that same steady attention. I realized how rarely anyone asked those questions anymore. "I think people assume once you reach a certain age, you stop changing," I said quietly. "I don't believe that," he replied. "I think we change all the time. We just get better at hiding it." That stayed with me. We weren't confessing anything, just acknowledging truths that felt safe to share. There was a sense of mutual respect in every word, an unspoken agreement to keep things honest and kind. At one point, my husband stepped onto the porch to ask if I needed anything. I smiled at him, feeling steady. "I'm fine, just enjoying the air." He nodded, content, and went back inside. There was no tension in that moment, only clarity. I wasn't stepping away from my life. I was stepping into awareness. As the night wound down, our conversation turned reflective. He spoke about his own life, the quiet adjustments, the things he wished he'd noticed sooner. There was no comparison, no longing, just understanding. When it was time to leave, we said goodbye like old friends. "Take care," he said warmly. "You too," I answered. On the drive home, the road stretched out under the headlights, and I felt calm. Not restless, not confused. Just awake in a way I hadn't been in years. I realized that connection doesn't always arrive with grand gestures. Sometimes it arrives as a mirror, showing you parts of yourself you forgot were still there. That night, lying awake beside my husband, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing, I felt gratitude. Gratitude for the life I had, and gratitude for the reminder that growth doesn't stop, no matter how familiar things become. Weeks passed, and life settled back into its familiar rhythm. The conversations at home were the same, the routines steady and dependable. Yet inside me, something had shifted, not dramatically, but enough that I noticed the way I moved through my days. I listened more closely. I paused before responding. I felt present in moments that once would have slipped by unnoticed. I ran into my husband's friend again under circumstances that felt almost accidental. The grocery store, of all places. I was comparing prices in the produce aisle when I heard my name spoken carefully, as if he wasn't sure it was really me. I turned, surprised, and there he was, holding a basket with only a few items inside. "Well, this is unexpected," I said, smiling. "Seems like it's that kind of season," he replied, full of small surprises. We laughed, keeping our voices low, aware of the quiet hum around us. There was no awkwardness, only an easy familiarity that felt earned rather than assumed. We walked through a few aisles together, talking about ordinary things. Weather, neighborhood changes, how different grocery stores seem to reflect different moods of a town. At the checkout, we paused, neither of us rushing. "It was good to see you," he said. "These little conversations, they matter." "They do," I agreed. That brief meeting stayed with me more than I expected. Not because it hinted at anything beyond itself, but because it reinforced a truth I was still learning. Connection didn't have to be intense to be meaningful. It just had to be real. Later that evening, my husband and I sat on the back porch, the sun dipping low and painting the sky in soft colors. He talked about his day, about things he was planning for the coming months. I listened, truly listened, and noticed how different that felt when I brought my full attention to the moment. "You seem lighter lately," he said suddenly. "Do I?" I asked, surprised. "Yeah," he nodded. "More. Present." I thought about that before answering. "I think I've just been reflecting more. Paying attention." He smiled, comfortable with that explanation. And it was true. The conversations I'd had, the awareness they sparked, weren't pulling me away from my life. They were bringing me back to it. Another gathering came and went, this time larger, noisier. I spoke with my husband's friend again, but briefly. A few exchanged words, a shared smile, nothing more. Yet the respect between us was clear. We didn't linger. We didn't need to. The understanding was already there. As the evening wore on, I found myself watching the room, the couples, the friendships that had lasted decades. I saw how easy it was to slip into patterns, to stop seeing each other fully. And I felt grateful for the reminder that awareness can be renewed at any stage of life. Driving home that night, I reflected on how unexpected moments can act like gentle guides. They don't push you somewhere new. They simply point out where you already are and ask if you're paying attention. I realized that growth doesn't always come from change in circumstances. Sometimes it comes from a change in perspective, from allowing yourself to be seen, even briefly, and carrying that sense of self back into your everyday life. As I prepared for bed, I caught my reflection in the mirror. I looked like the same woman I'd always been. But behind my eyes was a quiet confidence, a renewed sense of self-respect. I turned off the light feeling grounded, knowing that whatever came next, I was awake to it now. Time has a way of softening things,